Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Iris Elipse wash processed Panama from H&S Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And H&S, based out of Laramie, Wyoming. And this coffee was featured in a blind taste test rankings video earlier this year, where it finished second place out of 5 H&S coffees on that day. And when I initially saw this coffee on H&S's website, it immediately caught my interest, mostly due to the fact that it is a Panamanian geisha, and I've had some extremely positive results with H&S's coffees this year. But then when I dug a little further and found out that this coffee was part of their DNA altered pack, it added to my interest in a certain extent, as I wasn't entirely sure what the additional processing that might have been presented in this coffee was. But as a result, I was very curious to see how this one was going to turn out. So we will see how it turned out, as this right here is day 82. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our H&S recipe, which is a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which usually indicates a more medium fine grind. However, we went a little bit more fine on that grind as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee, this one they have listed as a hyper light as well. So this one they also describe as being the lightest roasted coffee that they've ever featured, and I can certainly see that, as this one is easily one of the lightest roasted coffees that we've ever reviewed on this channel. So this one is, by their standards, a hyper light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 16, first impression, and that was the blind taste test day. And this coffee was immediately notable due to its, I would say, slightly unnatural floral aspects that were presented within it, as it had a very intense and pronounced, slightly darker sense to it. The cup was pretty clean otherwise, with a generally positive start, and it was very interesting given that they suggested a 60-day rest period for this coffee, and this was obviously the day 16 mark. So I said to myself, it's just going to be kind of interesting to see how this coffee might change with that much rest. We did reopen this coffee on day 60. We opted for the Chemex, and the coffee did have some very notable grainy qualities to it at the forefront, as it feels very much skewed towards the darker berry profile of this coffee, giving it what I would describe as a berry kicks or Trix berry cereal feel to it. Additionally, there's a lingering floral aspect, as the coffee is reminiscent of a natural in terms of the overall intensity, which I had pretty mixed feelings on. I mean, if I'm buying a washed processed Panamanian geisha, then I'm hoping that it's going to be notably more clean and delicate, but this coffee was certainly acting a bit more like a natural. Day 63 through the April brewer, and the coffee has been the best it's been to this point, as it was a little less grainy, which does indicate that maybe a flat bottom brewer or some lower extraction adjustments might have worked a little better on this one. It is still presenting itself in a slightly more natural-like sense with a very strong berry aspect, otherwise a more defined coffee, as the florals remain quite prominent and pronounced. We move on to day 66, as we opted for the V60 with the higher extraction adjustments, and the coffee was the best it had been to this point, as it had a notable bit of grainy quality to it yet again, but it was made up for with the intensity, offering that natural-like feel to it, especially with the dark berry and floral sense, once again being reminiscent of that berry kicks, Trix berry cereal feel to me. And that's a note that I'm going to continue to go back on, honestly, because that's what this coffee continuously tasted like and felt like to me throughout the entirety of it. Day 69, through the Chemex with the higher extraction adjustments, and the coffee is continuing to improve overall in terms of the intensity, and it's continuing to remain mostly berry forward, with it presenting a slightly cleaner sense to it, with the graininess dissipating ever so slightly. That's something we're going to go back to though. A slight bit more brightness as it's increasing in the overall florality. We move on to day 72, as we opted for the V60 with the higher extraction adjustments once again, and the coffee once again certainly isn't lacking intensity, as it continues to offer some very prominent purple tones to it in the berry and floral sense yet again. There's a bit more of the graininess this time around, and what's so interesting about that is I previously mentioned that the graininess did feel a little toned down on that day, but from this point going forward, I could not get rid of that graininess, especially given that we were brewing it with those higher extraction adjustments. I feel like that really seems to accentuate a lot of those qualities within this coffee. Day 75, through the chemics with the higher extraction adjustments, and the coffee does continue to offer plenty of the graininess yet again. And I keep going back to that mostly because of just how pronounced and prominent the graininess was in this coffee. And I feel like that's probably a result of the profile of this coffee being as light as it is, because it's something that I couldn't really seem to tone down with this one. Interestingly, a little less brightness yet again, as there's an abundance of red and purple floral tones presented in a cereal-like sense, which continuously reminded me of those cereal aspects. Day 78 through the V60 with the higher extraction adjustments, and there's plenty of consistency to this coffee. Honestly, for a geisha, it didn't really have that much depth to it. It continuously presented a lot of the same components to it. Those purple, red floral tones, a lot of those Trix mixed berry cereal tones to it, as it does continue to kind of hinder the overall clarity with that graininess. Otherwise, it's pretty well defined. I mean, if you just kind of accept the graininess for what it is, and the other qualities in this one are pretty well pronounced in this coffee. All right, well, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 3 level 5s, so let's go through those. We'll start with the finish, level 5. And what's really unfortunate about the finish of this coffee is that it's the graininess. It does seem to linger so much within this coffee, and given that it's one of the most pronounced characteristics in this coffee, it's not necessarily an overly desirable coffee component to have presented within a coffee. So I don't necessarily like that aspect of this one. We'll move on to the florality, level 5, and all of the notes that they have listed on here are floral notes. I think they have rose, lilac, lavender, all of those notes. And yeah, I mean, it's very floral, but at the same time, it was much more of like that floral cereal, that floral graininess to me. And as a result, I kept going back to that kind of Trix cereal feel to it. And that's why the berry fruit is there at that level 5. Honestly, that coffee tastes as much like that mixed berry cereal as I could imagine for anything. And given that that was probably the only really dominant aspect of this coffee for me, it's the only thing I could kind of hang my hat on in terms of this tasting wheel. As you can see, there are a lot of really low marks within this coffee, mostly because the 3 things that were presented in this, that graininess, the florality, and the berry fruit qualities, were just so overly dominant, given that the base of this coffee was pretty clean, that it allowed for those 3 things to kind of just dominate the entirety of this one. We move on to level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness. Level 4. I had a very hard time deciding where I wanted to put the cleanliness for this one, because interestingly enough, it's in the same way as that pizza coffee was, pretty well defined, but the graininess is one of those things that can hinder the overall results in terms of the cleanliness for a coffee for me. And I toyed around with the idea of keeping this one at a level 3, but I said, I mean, it's cleaner than the gochujang coffee, I suppose. So level 4 is maybe a good place to put it, but truth be told, it's probably one of the most undeserving level 4s we've ever had, especially for a wash processed Panamanian geisha. So level 4 is where we opted. We'll move on. Sweetness, level 4. And in the same sense that I've continued to highlight that grainy mixed berry cereal quality, that's what I was getting in terms of the sweetness to it. Very sugary in that sense, and given that I wasn't really enjoying that aspect of this coffee, I had kind of mixed reactions and impressions of that as well. We'll move on. There's little else worth discussing, but there are 2 really big things. We'll start with the body, level 2. It had weirdly more texture than some of the other coffees that we reviewed in this series, so I'll kind of make of that whatever I will, but even then, none of them had a ton of body to them, and I think that might be a result of the profiles of these coffees being just as light as they were. And then the final thing we're discussing, the acidity, level 2. That's weird to me. This coffee had near to no brightness whatsoever, as it's very rare that we score coffees that low in terms of the brightness. There are very few coffees, probably less than 20 or so in the hundreds of reviews that we had, that have scored that low in terms of the overall brightness. So this coffee just seemed to lack any sort of acidity to it. So I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's weirdly a good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I can see why this one was featured in that DNA Altered series, because something doesn't quite feel right about this coffee. Like, this one certainly doesn't act like a wash processed Panamanian geisha. I mean, it's at the first point lacking the level of clarity and softness that usually washed Panamanian geishas do have. There's just so much intensity skewed in one specific direction that it kind of has hindered the overall experience for this coffee. My favorite thing about Panamanian geishas is their subtlety, their delicacy, at the same time offering such great depth to them, while this one was much more in your face and acted much more like a processed coffee as a result. So not necessarily my thing, but even then this coffee was much more a, I guess, curiosity thing as opposed to something that I thought I was going to necessarily enjoy. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you really like the more grainy qualities of a coffee and you really like your berry cereal, then this one's probably an interesting fit for you in that sense. Once again, I do want to keep the profile of this one in mind because I can't recall many coffees that we've had that have been lighter than this one. I mean, this one is just about as light as you could possibly imagine for a coffee, to the point where people have also described this one as being objectively underdeveloped, and I can see that too. So that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Iris Elipse Wash Process Panama from H&S Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.